I arrived at the church 10 minutes early. That was normal for me. I was raised to believe being early meant you cared. Being on time meant you respected people. And being late, well, that sent a message whether you meant it to or not. That morning, I cared more than I ever had in my life. The parking lot was nearly empty, a few cars scattered across the far end, probably people who came early for other reasons. I parked close to the entrance, shut off the engine, and sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. The quiet felt heavier than usual. My husband would have noticed it too. His name was Robert. We'd been married for 46 years, long enough that silence had its own language between us, long enough that I still caught myself turning my head, expecting to see him beside me. I stepped out of the car and adjusted my coat. The air was cool but clear, the kind of day that looks peaceful even when your world isn't. Inside, the church smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. Familiar, comforting. I chose a seat near the front, not the first row, but close enough. Robert never liked being right at the front. He said it made him feel like he was on display. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. At first, I told myself everyone would arrive together. People tend to do that for things like this. They show up late, embarrassed, whispering apologies as they slide into their seats. Minutes passed. I glanced toward the back doors. Nothing. I checked my watch, then looked up again. The pastor gave me a gentle nod from across the room. He didn't ask questions. He just waited. So did I. I thought about the last time Robert and I sat in this church together. It had been for a wedding years ago, one of our children's friends. We'd joked afterward about how quickly time moved, how suddenly everyone seemed to be getting married, having kids, building lives of their own. Blink and it's over, Robert had said. I hadn't understood what he meant back then. The doors opened once. My heart lifted before my mind could stop it. A stranger stepped in, glanced around, and quietly took a seat near the back. The doors closed again. That's when I knew. Not suspected, not worried. Knew. My children weren't coming. Not because they couldn't, not because of an emergency. They'd known the date. They'd been told the time. They'd acknowledged it. They just chose something else. The service began on schedule. The pastor spoke kindly, respectfully. He talked about Robert's life, his patience, his work ethic, the quiet way he showed up for people without asking for recognition. I listened closely, nodding at moments that felt especially true. Robert had never been a loud man. He didn't demand attention, but he noticed things. He remembered details. He showed up when it mattered. That's what made the empty seats harder to look at. I sat alone in the second row, my purse beside me where someone else should have been sitting. No familiar faces behind me, no whispered condolences, no comforting hands on my shoulders. Just me and the truth. When the service ended, the pastor asked if anyone wanted to say a few words. No one stood. He cleared his throat gently and moved on. Outside, the sun was bright, too bright for a day like that. I squinted slightly as I walked to my car, feeling the weight of every step. I drove home slowly, taking the long way without meaning to, past streets Robert and I had driven together for decades, past the grocery store where he used to insist on pushing the cart even when his knee started acting up, past the diner where we'd spent countless mornings drinking coffee and pretending we weren't getting older. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had. That hurt more than I expected. Inside, everything was exactly where Robert left it. His shoes by the door, his jacket still hanging on the hook, the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the hallway. I set my keys down and sat at the kitchen table. That's when the phone buzzed. I didn't rush to pick it up. Something in me already knew what it would say. A message. "Mom, sorry we couldn't make it today. Things got busy. Hope you understand." That was it. No mention of their father, no explanation worth reading twice. Just busy. I placed the phone face down and stared at the tabletop. I wasn't shocked. That surprised me. As the afternoon wore on, memories started lining up in my mind, like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was collecting. Missed calls, rescheduled visits, conversations cut short because something came up. I'd always filled in the gaps with excuses for them. They're busy, they're tired, they'll make time later. But later never came. I stood up and made myself a cup of tea. Muscle memory carried me through the motions. Boil the water, choose the mug Robert liked best, set it down carefully. My hands didn't shake. That scared me a little. Grief, I'd been told, comes in waves, but this felt more like a slow, steady pull, something drawing me toward a realization I couldn't ignore anymore. That evening, as the house grew darker and quieter, I sat in the living room and looked around at the life Robert and I had built together. We'd worked hard, we'd sacrificed, we'd shown up for our kids even when it wasn't convenient. We believed that mattered. I went to bed early that night, sleeping on Robert's side without thinking about it. The sheets still smelled like him, familiar, comforting. The next morning, I woke up clear-headed. Too clear. My phone had several messages. None of them asked how I was doing. None of them mentioned the funeral. Just updates, plans, casual check-ins. I responded politely. Short replies, neutral tone. I didn't bring up the funeral. I wanted to see something. Over the next few days, life continued as if nothing had happened. My children talked about their plans, their work, their schedules. They didn't ask about the service, didn't acknowledge the absence, and that told me everything I needed to know. I realized then that the funeral wasn't the wound. It was the confirmation. Robert used to say that people show you who they are when there's nothing left to gain. Standing alone in that church, I finally understood what he meant. I didn't cry. Not yet. I started thinking instead. About what I'd been giving, about what I'd been carrying, about what I'd been excusing for far too long. Grief changes you. Not at once. Slowly, quietly. It rearranges what you're willing to tolerate. And as I sat there in the house we'd shared for decades, I made a promise to myself. I would stop filling in the gaps for people who couldn't be bothered to show up. I didn't confront my children. I didn't ask for explanations or apologies. But after the day I buried my husband alone, I made a quiet decision, and the way I handled everything afterward would catch them completely off guard.
The day after the funeral, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had somewhere to be, not because I couldn't sleep. I just opened my eyes and felt awake, clear, as if something heavy had finally settled into place instead of floating around unresolved. The house was quiet, too quiet. Robert used to wake before me most mornings. He liked the quiet hours, said they belonged to people who paid attention. I'd tease him about it, tell him he was getting old. He'd just smile and pour the coffee anyway. I made coffee that morning out of habit, then caught myself reaching for a second mug. I put it back. Grief doesn't always show up as tears. Sometimes it shows up as small corrections to routines you didn't realize were shared. My phone sat on the counter, face down. I left it there. For years, I'd been the one to check in first, the one to remind, the one to ask how everyone was doing, even when no one asked me the same. I told myself it was because I cared more. That morning, I decided to see what would happen if I didn't. The hours passed quietly. I folded laundry, watered the plants, took a short walk around the block. Neighbors waved politely. A few stopped to ask how I was holding up. "I'm managing," I said. That was true. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed again. A message from my oldest. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. You okay?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. That question would have meant something to me before. Before the funeral, before the empty pews, before the silence. I typed back, "I'm fine." And that was it. No details, no reassurance, no emotional labor wrapped up in polite words. I set the phone down and didn't think about it again until evening. That night, another message came in, this time from my daughter. "Sorry again about yesterday. Things were crazy. We'll catch up soon." Catch up. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I sat in the living room and let myself remember the things I'd quietly done over the years. The favors, the financial help, the babysitting, the last-minute rescues when plans fell apart. I never kept score. I never wanted to. But suddenly, I could see the pattern clearly. I wasn't being appreciated. I was being relied on. There's a difference. I replied to my daughter with a simple, "Okay." No warmth, no anger, just okay. The next few days followed the same rhythm. They messaged, I answered briefly. They talked about their lives, I listened politely. None of them brought up the funeral again. That told me they were relieved. Relieved they didn't have to explain themselves. Relieved I wasn't upset. Relieved they could move on without consequences. That realization hurt more than the funeral itself. I thought about calling them, about explaining how that day felt, about explaining what it meant to sit alone while everyone else chose something more exciting. But then I remembered something Robert once told me. People don't change because you explain. They change because they feel the impact. So I stopped explaining. I stopped offering unsolicited help. I stopped reminding them of birthdays, appointments, deadlines. I stopped being available at a moment's notice, and I didn't announce any of it. I just stepped back. At first, they didn't notice. Why would they? I'd always adjusted around them, always made things easier. When that stopped, it didn't register immediately. Life still felt convenient, until it didn't. A week later, my son called. "Mom, quick question," he said. "Do you think you could watch the kids this weekend?" I paused. Normally, I would have said yes without hesitation, rearranged plans I didn't even remember making, told myself I'd rest later. "I can't," I said calmly. There was silence on the other end. "Oh," he said. "Why not?" "I have plans," I replied. That wasn't a lie. I planned to rest, to think, to take care of myself. "Well, okay," he said, clearly caught off guard. He hung up quickly. I sat there afterward, surprised by how steady my hands felt. The next request came a few days later, financial this time. Nothing major, just a short-term thing. I said no again. No explanation, no apology, just no. That's when the tone shifted. They started asking more questions, checking in more frequently, wondering out loud if something was wrong. "Are you upset?" my daughter asked during one call. "No," I said, honestly. "I'm just adjusting." "Adjusting to what?" she pressed. I thought about the church, the empty seats, the sunlight streaming through stained glass while I sat alone. To reality, I replied. She laughed nervously. What does that mean? It means I'm paying attention, I said. That ended the conversation. A few days later, my youngest stopped by unannounced. That was new. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands in his pockets. Hey, he said, just wanted to see you. That's nice, I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He looked around the house as if seeing it for the first time. Everything okay? He asked. Yes, I said. He shifted his weight. Listen, he said, after a moment, about Dad's funeral. I raised my hand gently. I'm not discussing that right now. He blinked. Oh, I'll let you know when I'm ready, I added. He stayed for a few minutes longer, talking about work, about plans. He left without pushing. That night, I slept well, not because things were resolved, but because I was finally being honest with myself. I wasn't punishing my children. I was correcting an imbalance. Weeks passed. The requests slowed. The casual assumptions disappeared. Conversations became more careful, more respectful. They could feel the shift now. They just didn't know what it meant yet. One afternoon, as I was organizing paperwork, I came across Robert's old folder, the one we kept tucked away for years. Legal documents, accounts, decisions we'd postponed because life always seemed too busy. I sat down and opened it, and for the first time since his passing, I felt something close to certainty. There were things that needed to be updated, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I scheduled an appointment. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. That night, I stood in the living room and looked at Robert's photograph on the mantel. You were right, I said softly. Showing up matters. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt settled. My children thought my silence meant forgiveness. They thought my calm meant nothing had changed. But while they were busy assuming things would return to normal, I was putting plans in place that would make sure nothing ever went back to the way it was before.
The office smelled like lemon cleaner and old paper. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped inside. Not the diplomas on the wall, not the polished desk, just the smell. Clean, orderly, familiar. The kind of place where decisions were made quietly and stuck. I'd been here before, years ago. Robert and I had sat across from the same desk, holding hands, talking about things people prefer not to think about until they have to. Back then, it felt theoretical. Now, it felt necessary. The attorney greeted me warmly. He remembered us, asked how I'd been holding up, offered condolences in a way that didn't feel rushed or rehearsed. I'm ready to review everything, I said. He nodded and opened a folder. For a moment, I hesitated, not because I was unsure, but because I finally understood the weight of what I was doing. These weren't emotional decisions, they were permanent ones, and that was the point. We went through documents slowly, accounts, property, beneficiaries, old assumptions that no longer made sense when laid out under bright office lights. Do you want to make changes? He asked gently. Yes, I said. I do. He didn't look surprised. We talked through options, consequences, legal language that stripped emotion away and replaced it with clarity. I appreciated that. Feelings don't belong in paperwork. Truth does. I didn't rush. I asked questions. I took notes. This wasn't about revenge in the way people imagine it. No shouting, no dramatic gestures. This was about correcting something that had quietly gone wrong over years. By the time I left, the folder felt heavier in my bag. Not because of guilt, because of resolve. That afternoon, I stopped by the cafe Robert and I used to visit on Fridays. The barista still remembered my order. Long time, she said softly. Yes, I replied. It has been. I sat by the window and watched people pass by. Couples, friends, families moving quickly through their lives, unaware of how fragile routines can be. I wondered if my children were moving just as fast, if they'd even noticed the changes yet. That evening, my daughter called. "Mom," she said, "we need to talk." I waited. "You've been distant," she continued. "Is everything okay?" "Yes," I said. "That's not an answer," she replied, irritation creeping into her voice. "It's an honest one," I said calmly. She sighed. "You didn't come to Emma's recital." "I wasn't invited," I said. There was a pause. "Well, you usually just show up." That landed harder than she realized. "I'm not assuming anymore," I replied. Silence. "Is this about Dad?" she asked finally. I took a breath. "Everything is about your father," I said. "You just didn't notice." She started to say something, then stopped.
The first thing I noticed was how quickly their tone changed. Before, my children spoke to me the way people do when they assume things will always be the same. Casual, relaxed, a little careless. Now, every conversation felt measured, like they were trying to figure out the right words before saying anything at all. That shift told me more than any apology could have. My oldest came by that weekend. He didn't call first, he just showed up, standing on the porch with his hands clasped together, looking older than he had a few weeks earlier. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. He walked into the living room slowly, like he wasn't sure where to sit anymore. That used to be his house too, once, back when he dropped by without hesitation, grabbed food from the fridge, and made himself comfortable. Now he waited. We sat across from each other, the space between us heavier than the furniture. "I spoke to the bank again," he said. "They said certain accounts are no longer accessible the same way." "Yes," I replied. He frowned. "I don't understand why you do that without telling us." I looked at him carefully. "You didn't tell me you weren't coming to your father's funeral." His shoulders stiffened. "That wasn't the same," he said. "It was," I replied. "You just didn't feel it the same way I did." He looked down. "We thought you'd understand." I did. I understood exactly where I stood. That quieted him. He leaned back and ran a hand through his hair. "This feels extreme." "It feels intentional," I corrected. There was a long pause. "You're punishing us," he said. "No, I'm responding." He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. "What do you want from us?" he asked. I thought about that. "I want awareness," I said, "and accountability. Not words, behavior." He nodded slowly. "We can do better." "I believe you can, but belief isn't the same as trust." That hurt him. I could see it. But it was true. Over the next few days, the calls increased. Group messages, invitations, requests to talk things out. They were trying to fix it now. But what they didn't understand was that this wasn't something that could be fixed quickly, not with brunches or apologies sent by text. I had lived through the absence already. One afternoon, my daughter called, her voice tight. "Mom, this is tearing the family apart," she said. I sighed softly. "No, it's revealing it." "That's not fair. You're making everything about one day." "It wasn't one day. It was years. That day just made it visible." She went quiet. "You never said anything," she said finally. "I shouldn't have had to. Presence isn't something you explain." She started crying then. Real tears, not defensive ones. "I didn't think you needed us the same way anymore," she admitted. That landed harder than anything else she'd said. "I needed you to show up," I replied. That was enough. We sat in silence for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. I believed her, but belief didn't erase consequences. A week later, all 3 of my children asked to meet together. That was new. We chose a neutral place, a small cafe near the park, public enough to keep things calm, familiar enough to feel safe. They arrived early. That alone was telling. We sat at a corner table, coffee cups between us. No one spoke at first.
My youngest broke the silence. "We messed up," he said. I nodded. "Yes. We didn't think missing the funeral would matter this much," he continued. "It mattered, because it showed me where I ranked." My oldest swallowed. "We didn't rank you." "You did. You just didn't mean to." They exchanged glances. "So now what?" my daughter asked. "It depends," I said, "on whether you understand this isn't about guilt, it's about responsibility." My youngest leaned forward. "We'll be there now for everything." I shook my head gently. "I'm not asking for promises." "Then what are you asking for?" my daughter asked. I looked at each of them in turn. "Consistency," I said, "and acceptance that things won't go back to how they were." They frowned. "You're our mom," my oldest said. "Things are supposed to go back." I smiled faintly. "No, they're supposed to move forward. Sometimes that means different." They didn't like that answer, but they didn't argue. After the meeting, I felt drained, but not regretful. They were starting to understand something important. Love doesn't guarantee access, and history doesn't erase accountability. The next step came quietly. A letter arrived from the attorney's office, confirming that everything had been finalized, filed, recorded, locked in. I placed it in the drawer beside Robert's things. That night, my youngest called again. "Is there anything we can do to change this?" he asked. I paused. "You can change yourselves," I said. "The rest is already done." "That feels final," he said. "It is, and that's okay." Silence stretched between us. "Dad wouldn't have wanted this," he said softly. I closed my eyes for a moment. "Your father wanted you to show up. He taught you that by example." He didn't respond. A few days later, my daughter tried a different approach. She brought photo albums, memories, stories, laughter mixed with tears. I listened. I smiled. I remembered. But I didn't bend. Because bending was what I'd done my whole life, and bending had taught me I always would. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't lonely. I missed Robert deeply. That ache would never go away. But I wasn't alone in myself. I'd reclaimed something important, my sense of worth. My children were learning, slowly, painfully, honestly, and that was necessary. The following week, my oldest called again. "There's something else," he said. I waited. "About the property," he continued. "The house up north. It's not listed the way it used to be." I smiled softly, though he couldn't see it. "Yes, that's correct." His voice cracked slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means you're going to learn how to stand on your own, the way your father and I did." His voice cracked slightly. "This is really happening." "Yes," I said. "It is." When the call ended, I sat quietly, feeling the weight of everything settle into place. This wasn't revenge fueled by anger. It was consequence built from truth. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to peace. My children thought the changes were finished. They were wrong, because the final step I took, one I hadn't told anyone about yet, would make it impossible for them to ever treat my presence as an option again.
The final step wasn't dramatic. That's the part people don't expect. They imagine some grand announcement, a confrontation where everything spills out at once. But real consequences don't arrive that way. They show up quietly, already signed, already settled, already beyond debate. The morning I completed it, I woke up calm, not numb, not angry, calm. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, sunlight stretching across the floor just like it had every morning for years. I thought about Robert, about how he used to read the paper in that same chair, shaking his head at the headlines and saying, "People never think the bill comes due." That thought stayed with me. At 10 o'clock, I drove to the office one last time. The attorney greeted me with a nod, no small talk. He knew why I was there. "We've reviewed everything," he said. "Once this is executed, there's no confusion." "That's exactly what I want," I replied.
He slid the document across the desk. It was clear, direct, fair, and final. I signed without hesitation. As I walked out of the building, I felt lighter than I had in months, not because I'd taken something away, but because I'd stopped carrying what was never meant to be mine alone. That afternoon, I went home and did something I hadn't done since the funeral. I rested. The phone buzzed a few times, messages, missed calls. I didn't check them right away. That evening, my oldest showed up again. This time, he looked different, tired, uneasy. I spoke to the attorney, too, he said as soon as he sat down. He wouldn't give details, but he said things are settled. Yes, I said. He swallowed. You weren't kidding. No, I replied. Mom, he said, lowering his voice, this changes everything. I met his eyes. That's usually when people start paying attention. He leaned forward. Why didn't you tell us you were doing all this? I folded my hands in my lap. Why didn't you tell me you weren't coming to your father's funeral? He closed his eyes briefly. That's not fair, he said. It's equal, I replied. He shook his head. We didn't think it would lead to this. That's the problem, I said gently. You didn't think. He stood up and paced the room. So what now? We just live with it? Yes, I replied, the same way I lived with being alone that day. He stopped pacing. That's harsh, he said. It's honest, I replied. He left not long after that, quieter than he arrived. The calls came faster after that, all three of them, sometimes separately, sometimes together. They wanted clarity, reassurance, a way back to how things were. I gave them clarity. I didn't give them reversal. I'm not doing this to hurt you, I told them during one long conversation. I'm doing this because relationships don't survive on assumptions. My daughter cried again. I didn't think missing one day would cost us so much. I softened then, just a little. It didn't, I said. It revealed something that was already there. That week, I visited Robert's grave alone. I brought fresh flowers, sat on the bench nearby, and talked to him the way I used to talk across the dinner table. I finally did it, I said quietly. I stopped fixing things for everyone else. The breeze stirred the leaves above me. For a moment, I imagined him smiling, that small, knowing smile he always had when he thought I was stronger than I realized. When I got home, there was a letter waiting, handwritten, from my youngest. He wrote about guilt, about regret, about wishing he could go back and do that day differently. I didn't think you'd notice, he wrote. That sentence stayed with me. I called him that evening. I noticed, I said calmly. I always notice. He knows, he replied. I just didn't think it would matter so much. It matters, I said, because showing up is how you say someone matters. He was quiet for a long time. I'm scared I lost you, he said finally. I took a breath. You didn't lose me, I said. You lost the version of me who kept pretending nothing hurt. That seemed to sink in. The next family gathering was different, smaller, quieter, intentional. They asked before assuming, listened before speaking, stayed longer instead of rushing out. It didn't fix everything, but it changed the tone. Still, the distance remained, not as punishment, as reality. One afternoon, my daughter asked me directly, "Is there any chance you'll change your mind?" I looked at her carefully. "About what?" I asked. "About the decisions you made," she said. I shook my head. "No." She nodded slowly. "Then I guess this is the new normal." "Yes," I said, "and it's not a bad one if you respect it." That night, I went through the house, room by room. I donated things I didn't need, packed away items I'd been holding on to out of habit, made space. Not just physically, emotionally. Weeks passed. The urgency faded. The panic softened into acceptance. My children adjusted. They had to. One evening, my oldest called again. "I get it now," he said quietly. "Get what?" I asked. "That you weren't trying to teach us a lesson. You were protecting yourself." "Yes," I said. I wish we'd done better, he added. So do I. But wishing didn't rewrite history, it just informed the future. As winter approached, I felt steadier than I had in years. I wasn't carrying resentment. I wasn't waiting for apologies. I was living. Robert used to say that dignity is what you choose when no one's watching. Standing alone at his funeral taught me that. Everything I did after was simply honoring that truth. My children believed the hardest part was over. They thought acceptance meant the story was finished. But the final chapter, what I chose to do with my life next, would determine whether they truly understood what presence, respect, and family actually mean.
Once the urgency faded, what remained was something far more uncomfortable: reality. My children stopped calling every day, not because they didn't care, but because there was nothing left to argue about. The decisions had been made, the documents signed, the shock had worn off. Now they had to live inside the consequences, and so did I. The house felt different in those weeks, not lonely, just honest. There were fewer interruptions, fewer last-minute requests disguised as conversation. When the phone rang, it was because someone genuinely wanted to talk, not because they needed something fixed. That change alone told me I'd done the right thing. One afternoon, my daughter stopped by with coffee. No agenda, no paperwork, no emotional buildup. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd sat alone after the funeral. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. I waited. "You've always been the safety net," she continued. "I don't think we realized how much we leaned on you." "I didn't either," I replied. She nodded. "Until it wasn't there." That was the first time one of them said it out loud. Not sorry, not defensive, aware. She looked around the kitchen. "This place feels different." "It is," I said. "So am I." She smiled faintly. "I can see that." We talked for a while about small things: work, weather, plans that didn't involve me rearranging my life. When she left, she hugged me. Not tightly, not urgently, just present. That mattered. My oldest took longer. He kept his distance at first. I think he needed time to untangle guilt from pride. When he finally invited me to lunch, his voice sounded careful, like he didn't want to push the wrong button. We met at a quiet restaurant halfway between our houses. "I didn't realize how much you handled behind the scenes," he admitted after we ordered. "The finances, the planning, the things that just worked. I did them because they needed doing. And because you could," he added. "Yes," I replied, "but being able doesn't mean obligated." He nodded slowly. "I'm learning that." That sentence told me he was finally growing up, not just aging. My youngest struggled the most. He bounced between regret and resentment, sometimes in the same conversation. He wanted reassurance without responsibility, forgiveness without change. I didn't give him either. One evening, he called frustrated. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "You don't fix it. You live differently." "That feels vague," he said. "It's supposed to. Life doesn't come with instructions." He went quiet. Weeks passed. Holidays approached. This time, they didn't assume. They asked, "Would you like to come? What works for you?" No pressure. I chose what felt right. Sometimes I went, sometimes I didn't. And for the first time, that choice belonged to me alone. I noticed something else, too. They started showing up for each other more. Without me filling in the gaps, they had to step up, coordinate, compromise, take responsibility. It wasn't smooth, but it was real. One evening, I found myself laughing, actually laughing while on the phone with my daughter, not out of politeness, out of ease. That felt new and good. I thought about Robert often during that time. how he used to say that raising kids wasn't about keeping them comfortable, it was about preparing them to stand without leaning. "I think they're finally standing," I said aloud once, sitting alone in the living room. The house didn't answer, but I felt him there anyway. The first anniversary of his passing came quietly. No big gathering, no speeches. Just me at the cemetery with fresh flowers and steady hands. This time, I didn't feel hollow. I felt grounded. Later that day, all 3 of my children called, separately. Each one acknowledged the date. Each one said his name. It took them a year, but they arrived. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself, played music Robert used to like, let memories come and go without forcing them away. I realized then that my revenge, if that's what people would call it, wasn't about loss. It was about balance. I hadn't taken something from my children. I'd stopped giving what was taken for granted. And in doing so, I gave them something far more valuable: awareness. As winter turned to spring, I made changes of my own. I downsized, moved into a smaller place closer to the park, somewhere bright and manageable. My children helped, but only when I asked. They respected that. On moving day, my oldest paused in the doorway of the new place. "This feels like you," he said. "It is," I replied. The distance between us had changed, not grown wider or smaller, but clearer, defined by mutual respect instead of obligation. That night, after everyone left, I sat on my new couch and looked around. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt free. Not free from family, but free from the expectation that love means overextending yourself until there's nothing left. I slept well that night, deeply. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, warm and steady. I made coffee and stood quietly, listening to the sounds of a life that finally felt balanced. My phone buzzed once. A message from my youngest. "Thinking of Dad today. Wish I'd shown up sooner. I'm trying to do better." I stared at the screen. Then I typed back, "I see that." That was enough. I thought the lesson had finally landed. I thought the hardest truths had already been faced. But one final moment, unexpected and unavoidable, would test whether my children had truly changed, or whether they were simply reacting to consequences they still hoped would fade.
Change doesn't announce itself. It slips in quietly, then waits to see if it's welcome. For a while, things stayed steady. My children checked in without needing something. They listened more than they talked. They didn't rush me, didn't assume, didn't push. It felt real. That's why what happened next caught me off guard. It started with a phone call from my oldest. "Mom," he said, sounding hesitant, "I wanted to ask you something before it turns into a bigger conversation." I paused. "Go ahead." "There's a situation," he said. "Temporary. We're trying to figure out options." I didn't interrupt. "Money's tight right now. Nothing dramatic, just complicated." I stayed quiet long enough that he filled the space himself. "I'm not asking for anything yet," he added quickly. "I just wanted to talk." That was new. Not the situation, the pause. "What are you hoping for?" I asked calmly. He hesitated. "Advice," he said. "Mostly." I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. So I gave advice. Thoughtful, practical, realistic advice. No promises, no offers. Just perspective. He thanked me and ended the call. 2 days later, my daughter called. Different tone, same undercurrent. "We might need help with childcare for a few weeks," she said carefully, "just until things stabilize." I took a breath. "I can't," I said. There was silence. Not the defensive kind, the disappointed kind. "Oh," she said softly. "Okay." She didn't argue,
didn't guilt me, didn't bring up the past. She just accepted it. And that's when I realized this wasn't about need. It was about habit. They were checking to see if the old version of me still existed, if the boundaries were real or temporary. Later that week, my youngest called. Straight to the point. "We're in a bind, and I don't know who else to ask." I waited. "I know I don't get to expect anything," he continued, "but I want to be honest." I appreciated that. "What do you need?" I asked. "Support," he said. "Not money, just presence." That word again. Presence. I thought about the church, the empty pew, the quiet. "I can offer time. I can't offer rescue." "That's enough," he replied quickly, and for the first time I believed him. The following weeks were telling. They struggled, but they didn't collapse. They adapted. They solved problems without handing them to me. They leaned on each other instead of defaulting to me, and I stayed available in a way that felt healthy. Then came the moment that truly tested everything. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. All three of them showed up at my place, together, unannounced but not disrespectful. They stood there, waiting. "We need to talk," my oldest said. I stepped aside and let them in. We sat in the living room. No coffee, no distractions, just honesty. "We know we messed up," my daughter began, "and we're not here to undo what's been done." That surprised me. "We're here because we don't want to lose you in the future," my youngest added. I folded my hands. "Then say what you need to say." My oldest swallowed. "We treated your presence like it was guaranteed, like you'd always be there no matter what." "Yes," I said. "We don't want to live that way anymore," he continued, "and we don't want our kids to learn that either." That landed, not because it was emotional, but because it was specific. "We're asking," my daughter said carefully, "if there's room to rebuild, not to go back, but to move forward." I looked at them for a long moment. "This isn't about permission, it's about consistency." "We know," my youngest replied, "and we're willing to prove it." "Proof takes time," I said. They nodded. "I won't chase you, and I won't carry what isn't mine." "That's fair," my oldest said. Silence settled between us. Not awkward, respectful. After they left, I sat alone and thought about how far things had come and how easily they could still unravel. Change is fragile when it's new. That night, I dreamed about Robert. He was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the paper like always. He looked up and smiled. "You did good," he said. I woke up with that sentence still echoing. The next few months confirmed it. They showed up, not perfectly, but consistently. They remembered dates, asked questions, stayed present even when it wasn't convenient, and I stayed steady. No overgiving, no disappearing, balanced. One afternoon, my daughter brought her kids over just to visit. No request, no reason. Watching her sit on the floor with them, fully engaged, I saw something different. Awareness. Later, as she helped clean up, she said quietly, "I didn't understand what we lost that day. I do now." I nodded. Understanding doesn't erase the past, but it can shape the future. She smiled. "We're trying." That was enough. Not forgiveness, effort. As I watched them leave, I realized something important. The strongest consequence wasn't what I took away, it was what I refused to give back automatically. Respect had to be earned again, and this time, they were earning it. I believed we'd finally reached solid ground, but one final decision, deeply personal and impossible to reverse, still remained, and how I chose to handle it would determine what kind of legacy my children truly inherited.
There are moments in life when you realize you've already made the most important decision. You're just living with it now. For me, that moment came quietly, on an ordinary morning.
I was sitting at my kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the floor, when I opened the drawer where I kept Robert's things. Not out of sadness, not out of habit, out of readiness. Inside was the last envelope, the one I hadn't shared with anyone, the one decision I'd made alone, without asking for opinions or permission. Legacy isn't about money. It's about what you teach people to value when you're no longer correcting them in real time. My children had changed, that much was clear. They showed up now, they listened, they respected my boundaries. They made room for me instead of expecting me to squeeze myself into their lives. But growth doesn't erase history, and accountability doesn't disappear just because behavior improves. I had already decided what came next. That afternoon, I asked my children to come by, not urgently, not emotionally, just intentionally. They arrived together, cautious but calm. We sat in the living room, the same space where so many hard conversations had taken place. "I want to talk about something important," I said. They waited. "I've finalized my plans for the future." My oldest nodded. "We understand." "That includes my will," I said plainly. There it was. No drama, no build-up, just truth. My daughter inhaled slowly. "Okay." I appreciated that response. "I've made arrangements that reflect the life I want to live now and the values I want to leave behind." They listened without interrupting. "I'm not doing this out of anger," I added, "and I'm not revising it to test anyone." My youngest spoke carefully. "What does that mean for us?" "It means what I leave behind will support independence, not entitlement." Silence filled the room. "I've allocated resources to causes that mattered to your father: community work, education, support systems for people who show up for one another." They nodded slowly. "And I've ensured you're each secure, but not dependent." That distinction mattered. My oldest swallowed. "You're serious?" "Yes, and I'm at peace with it." They didn't argue. They didn't ask me to change my mind. That told me everything. After they left, I sat alone and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not because I'd withheld something, but because I'd finally aligned my life with my values. In the months that followed, life settled into a rhythm that felt honest. My children visited, sometimes together, sometimes alone. They didn't assume access to my time or energy. They asked, and when I said no, they accepted it. Respect doesn't need to be loud to be real. One afternoon, my daughter asked me something quietly while we were washing dishes together. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" she asked. I thought about the church, the empty seats, the stillness. "I wish your father hadn't been buried alone," I said. She nodded, eyes wet. "Me too. But I don't regret what came after, because it taught all of us something important." "What's that?" she asked. I said that love without presence is just intention, and intention isn't enough. She hugged me then, not out of guilt, out of understanding. On the second anniversary of Robert's passing, all 3 of my children came with me to the cemetery. No reminders, no prompting. They stood beside me as I placed flowers on his grave. This time, I wasn't alone, and this time, it mattered. As we walked back to our cars, my youngest said quietly, "I wish we'd been there that first day." I looked at him. "So do I replied. "But wishing doesn't undo, it informs." He nodded. "We won't forget again." I believed him, because they weren't reacting anymore. They were choosing. That evening, back in my home, I sat with a cup of tea and thought about how much had changed. Not because I demanded it, but because I stopped accepting less than I deserved.
I didn't punish my children, I taught them. I taught them that showing up is not optional, that presence is the clearest form of love, and that silence, when chosen carefully, can speak louder than anger ever could. My husband's funeral was the day I sat alone, but it was also the day I finally stood up for myself, and everything that followed proved one simple truth. When you stop carrying people who refuse to show up, you give them the chance to learn how to walk on their own. If you feel comfortable, I'd appreciate it if you left a like on this video. It helps these quiet stories reach the people who might need them most. You can subscribe to the channel if you'd like to hear more stories like this. Stories about love, endurance, and the things we carry longer than we should. And if you want to, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read them, truly. Knowing this story traveled farther than my living room gives me more comfort than you might imagine. Thank you for sitting with me. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people you love.